Her Excellency Himali Aruna Tilaka, Sri Lankan Ambassador to Nepal, and dear participants, welcome to NICE webinar on Nepal-Sri Lanka relations. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified or understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Neighborhood Studies is one of the major research centers. Through neighborhood studies, we look at the range of cross-cutting issues such as the political development, economic activities, cross-border activities, and foreign affairs related issues on security surfacing in its immediate neighborhood, India and China, in addition to extended neighbors such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Maldives. The study focused to explore and identify emerging priorities in the neighborhood and generate evidence and analysis. Today's talk is organized by Neighborhood Studies Center of NICE. Nepal and Sri Lanka enjoy excellent relations. Both the countries signed diplomatic relations on 1st July 1957 and bilateral trade agreement in April 1979. Both the countries have historical cultural ties and stand together at several regional and multilateral forums. In this context, we have invited Her Excellency Himali Aruna Tilaka, Sri Lankan Ambassador to Nepal, to speak on Nepal-Sri Lanka relations. Her Excellency Himali Aruna Tilaka is a career diplomat, having joined the Sri Lankan Foreign Service in July 1998. Immediately prior to her appointment as Ambassador to Nepal, she headed the Africa Affairs Division and the International Security and Counterterrorism Division of the Sri Lankan Foreign Ministry as Director General. Her overseas assignments include Canberra, where she has served as a Deputy High Commissioner with concurrent accreditation to New Zealand, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Samoa. Sri Lankan Ambassador in Paris and Minister, Head of Chancellery with concurrent accreditation to Spain and Portugal, and the permanent mission of Sri Lanka to the United Nations in Geneva as First Secretary. Her previous assignment in the Foreign Ministry include the Political Affairs, Europe, CIS, and Americas Division, where she was the Acting Director General from 2010 to 2014, and during which time Sri Lanka hosted the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, the Counter-Terrorism Unit, and the Public Communication Division. In January 2015, Her Excellency was seconded as the President's Secretariat as the Director of Foreign Affairs, where she worked closely with the Senior Advisor to the President and Foreign Affairs, Mr. Jayanath Dhanapala, until August 2015. She has represented Sri Lanka as a member of government delegation to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Colombo 2013, United Nations General Assembly in New York 2012 and 2013, St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in 2011, and also accompanied the government delegation for talks with the LGT and the ceasefire agreement in Geneva, handling media relations in 2006. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, she worked with the Women and Media Collective and the Sri Lankan Women's NGOs Forum for Beijing 1995 in Colombo. She is an alumna of George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies, Germany, and Daniel Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, Honolulu, Hawaii, and Pakistan Foreign Service Academy, Islamabad. She holds a Master of Arts degree from the Middlebury College School in France, and a Bachelor of Arts degree with major in French from the University in the South Swanee in Tennessee, USA. She has completed her secondary education at Devi Balika Vidyalaya, Colombo, and speaks Sinhalese, which is her mother tongue, English and French. She enjoys classic music and yoga. Her Excellency, you will have around 30 to 40 minutes to make your initial remarks, which will be followed by questions and answers. We request all our participants to drop questions in the Zoom chat, as well as on the Facebook Live. Please do share our Facebook Live video on your wall so that it reaches to greater audience. Thank you very much, Excellency. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal, and also Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement for inviting me to speak on Nepal-Sri Lanka relations. And Aibowan and Namaste to all of you who are joining us on Zoom. Nepal-Sri Lanka relations date back to the ancient times Of course, formal diplomatic relations were established on the 1st July 1957. We celebrated the 60th anniversary of the relations in 2017 with the issuance of a special stamp depicting the Maya Devi temple in Lumbini and the temple of the sacred tooth relic, Sri Dalada Maligawa in Kandy, Sri Lanka. These sacred places of Buddhist significance represent the very nature of our relations. The historical and religious links between Nepal and Sri Lanka go back many centuries, and this has laid the foundation for the bilateral relationship. I would like to look at this relationship from the perspective of its evolution from historical times through the recent times to the present, and also the future prospects. But before that, let me begin with a brief overview of Sri Lanka, which I hope will give context to our main theme. Sri Lanka has an ancient history spanning more than 2,500 years. It is rich in natural and human resources and is located midway between the east-west sea lanes, also known as the spice routes or the maritime silk roads. Sorry. For this reason, from ancient times, Sri Lanka has attracted many visitors to its shores. They included traders, scholars, and explorers from the Romans to the Chinese and the Arabs. Marco Polo, Fahian, and Ibn Battuta are some of the more well-known visitors who came to Sri Lanka. Due to its strategic location, Sri Lanka was a transit point as well as an international trading center where merchants came in search of luxury items such as precious stones and pearls, as well as spices. Being a trading hub and sitting in the midst of major sea lanes, our people were outward looking and naturally hospitable towards visitors. And these qualities, I must say, have become the mainstay of our tourism industry in more modern times. Today, Sri Lanka's population is nearly 22 million, comprising Sinhalese, Tamils, the Muslims, and Burghers. And also people belonging to the 4 major religions in the world, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity, live in Sri Lanka side by side. The majority are Buddhists, numbering about 70.2% of the total population. We have high human development indices, which are on par with some developed countries. And we have also enjoyed universal adult franchise since 1931 and is the oldest democracy in Asia. The system of governance is a presidential one, where the executive president is elected directly by the people and is both the head of state as well as the head of government. His Excellency Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected as the 7th executive president of Sri Lanka on 16th November 2019. Sri Lanka has undergone 30 years of brutal separatist terrorism and also witnessed IS-inspired violent extremism in the form of deadly bomb attacks on Easter Sunday last year. Therefore, national security is one of the top priorities for us in safeguarding our people and the economy. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa underscored his commitment to safeguard national security without compromising the democratic space available to the people in his policy statement upon which he was elected to office. In the conduct of our foreign relations, Sri Lanka firmly believes in sovereign equality, mutual respect, and non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. We are a founding member of the non-aligned movement, same as Nepal, and have maintained a non-aligned foreign policy which continues under the present government. We are also committed to regional cooperation and security, and we maintain good relations with all our partners. As an island nation, maritime security is another crucial factor for Sri Lanka, and we actively engage in international negotiations on maritime security. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is a case in point. As for the economy, Sri Lanka is a lower middle income country. Traditionally, our economy was based on agriculture, and Ceylon tea, rubber, coconut, and spices, which are known as cash crops, were our main export commodities. In the post-independence period, economic focus was on self-reliance, and industries were focused on import substitution. Economic liberalization in 1978 led to increased foreign investment as well as participation of the private sector in economic activities. Today, apparels have emerged as the main export commodity from Sri Lanka, which contributes over $8 billion to the economy. We continue to export Ceylon tea, rubber, coconut, spices, and gems and jewelry, and also that we used to export earlier. And some of the newer additions to our export basket now are seafood, finished rubber products, IT BPM services, food preparations, electrical and electronic goods. Remittances and tourism are the other key contributors of foreign exchange to the national economy. Achieving Sri Lanka's full economic potential was stymied by the 30-year-long conflict and youth uprisings, which had a devastating impact on the socio-economic fabric of the country. The loss of human capital and resources also prevented us from reaping the expected economic benefits. However, the Sri Lankan economy showed resilience and managed to maintain a reasonable economic growth even during conflict years. Welfare measures that were provided to the people continued uninterrupted. Free education and free health care that is available throughout the country continued to be provided, including in the areas that were under the stranglehold of the terrorists. The conflict was finally brought to a conclusion in 2009 under the leadership of President Mahinda Rajapaksa, when the Sri Lankan security forces decisively defeated the LTTE. And I must mention that the present president, His Excellency Gotabaya Rajapaksa, was at the time the secretary to the Ministry of Defense and was a key figure who prominently featured at this transformative moment in our modern history. Thereafter, with the conflict behind us, the government was able to give focused attention to economic development, whilst also working on post-conflict rehabilitation, reconciliation, and rebuilding. Sri Lanka's ancient renown as a trading center was revived in repositioning the country as a regional hub towards greater economic prosperity. With this strategy in view, physical infrastructure development was given a major push in the post-conflict years. Roads, airports, and ports were built to improve the country's connectivity both within the country as well as to the rest of the world. With the long-term vision of making Sri Lanka a maritime logistics hub, the government also initiated a new port city on reclaimed land in Colombo. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's policy framework identifies 10 key policies aimed at achieving 4 main outcomes: a productive citizenry, a contented family, a disciplined and just society, and a prosperous nation. Given the gradual shifting of global economic power to Asia, a key component of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's vision is to develop strong bonds with reciprocal commercial ties and trade relationships with our Asian neighbors. The COVID pandemic has brought the world economy to its knees, and Sri Lanka has not been spared. However, we have managed to keep the pandemic fairly controlled. The strategy adopted by the government was a proactive one to prevent a large outbreak in the country and save lives. From the very beginning, the government worked towards eliminating the virus from the country and preventing new infections. Towards the end of January, the president established a task force under the leadership of the commander of the army, with all relevant stakeholders, including health, law enforcement, the military and so on, and pursued a strategy of detection, contact tracing, and treatment. Restrictions on mobility were imposed to prevent the spread of the virus inside the country, while the health, military, and law enforcement sectors worked day in, day out in coordination with the local authorities to ensure strict adherence to health guidelines. And I must say that the media also played a crucial role in disseminating health guidelines and government directives to the public. Sri Lanka has been able to keep the infected cases to about 2,700 as of today. 11 deaths have been recorded from the country due to COVID, and at present there are only about 665 active cases in Sri Lanka. Our fatalities are well below the global figures, and recoveries are significantly higher than the global average. Early and timely intervention and preventive measures has enabled the country to recommence economic activities despite the continued threat that is posed by the COVID pandemic. Now let me come to the main part of the presentation today, Nepal-Sri Lanka relations. One cannot speak about the relationship between our two countries without looking at the historical and cultural context. The links between Nepal and Sri Lanka go back to ancient times. Buddhism is the first point of contact between the two countries and has provided a solid foundation to our friendship. Nepal holds a special place for Sri Lankans because of Lumbini. According to the great chronicle of Ceylon, the Mahavansa, Lord Buddha visited Sri Lanka 3 times. And Sri Lanka has preserved the message of Gautama Buddha in the form of Theravada Buddhism, ever since Buddhism was introduced to the island in 250 BC. The Mahavansa also records the marriage between a Shakya princess, Bhaddakachayana, to King Panduwastev, who was the second king of Sri Lanka, around 350 BC. Bhaddakachayana was the daughter of King Pandushakya and the granddaughter of King Amitodana, who was the uncle of Prince Siddhartha Gautama. The cultural links between Sri Lanka and Nepal are unique and transcend into a spiritual connection with Buddhism weaving through it. This close connection has continued to the modern times. It is noteworthy that Sri Lanka inspired the resurgence of Theravada Buddhism in Nepal. A delegation of Sri Lankan Buddhist monks led by Venerable Narada Mahathero came to Nepal in 1946 and was instrumental in reviving Theravada Buddhism in Nepal. It is further recorded that the Venerable Mahathero requested the Prime Minister of Nepal at the time to declare Baishak Purnima, or Vesak as we call it in Sri Lanka, as a public holiday in Nepal. The Sri Lanka Mahavihara and the Dutukamunu Pilgrims Rest in Lumbini are visual symbols of the special connection between Sri Lanka and Nepal. Sri Lanka has also expressed its commitment to support the development of Lumbini, and this has been conveyed at the highest level. Following Sri Lanka's independence in 1948, a number of high-level visits have been exchanged between the two countries, which is a measure of the strength of our bilateral relations. The first one, of course, was the visit of King Mahendra to Sri Lanka in 1957. This was a significant visit as it was the first from Nepal at the highest level after Sri Lanka regained independence as a sovereign nation. It also paved the way for the establishment of bilateral relations a few months later in the same year. Sri Lanka's head of state at the time, Sir William Gopallava, attended the wedding ceremony of Crown Prince Birendra in 1970 and also his coronation in 1975. Starting from the first executive president of Sri Lanka, President J.R. Jayawardena, who visited Nepal in 1978, all executive presidents of Sri Lanka would visit Nepal over the next 40 years. The last 2 visits were when the current president of Nepal, the Right Honorable Vidya Devi Bandari, attended the UN Vesak Day celebrations in Sri Lanka in 2017, and the visit of President Maithripala Sirisena the following year to attend the 4th BIMSTEC summit in Kathmandu, which was followed by a state visit. The two countries initially conducted bilateral relations through honorary consuls and non-resident ambassadors until the Sri Lankan embassy was opened in Kathmandu in 1993 and Nepal opened its embassy in Colombo in 1995. When SAARC was born, this made more frequent interactions between our leaders possible on the sidelines of the summit meetings. And in 1998, which was the golden jubilee of Sri Lanka's independence, that year happened to coincide with the 10th SAARC summit. Nepal was the chair at the time, and Nepal graciously waived its turn to host the summit and gave that chance to Sri Lanka to do the honors, given the significance of that year to us. The golden jubilee of diplomatic relations between Sri Lanka and Nepal was commemorated in 2007. This landmark event was marked by the exchange of visits between the two foreign ministers. A number of important economic initiatives were undertaken during the years that followed. 2 agreements were finalized towards setting up a joint commission and the renewal of the air services agreement. I say renewal because there had been an original air services agreement which was signed in 1977, and there were also direct flights that Nepali Airlines operated to Colombo at the time. Unfortunately, the flights had to be suspended after a few years due to the conflict in Sri Lanka. So both these agreements were signed during President Mahinda Rajapaksa's visit to Nepal in 2009. Economic ties are an important aspect in any relationship. For Sri Lanka and Nepal, as developing countries and regional partners, trade and investment are a crucial component of the bilateral relationship. The agreements covering air services, trade, joint commission, and avoidance of double taxation all provide the enabling framework for the two countries to go by. The trade agreement of 1979 simplified the processes related to customs formalities and various import-export charges, among other things. The ADT, which was signed in 1999, is also important as it facilitates a private sector investment in the two countries. The air services agreement, as I mentioned, allows direct connectivity between the two capitals. The agreement to set up a joint commission identified 14 specific areas for bilateral cooperation. They included trade, finance, agriculture, industry, infrastructure, science and technology, environment, tourism, education, health, and so on. The Joint Commission also provides the ideal platform for the two countries to discuss the entire gamut of the bilateral relations and the level of cooperation. It also provides a platform to discuss and resolve issues related to bilateral cooperation. We hope to be able to convene the Joint Commission as early as possible. It is noteworthy that a number of joint ventures had been signed between our private sectors in the past, particularly in banking and insurance. While some of them may no longer be valid, this is an important element in the relationship that I think should be encouraged. The first joint venture was the Nepal Sri Lanka Merchant Banking Limited that was established in 1996. Then the Nepal Bank of Ceylon is another example. Then Bank and Sri Lanka's Hattha National Bank had entered into a technical services agreement in 2002. Currently, there are joint ventures in the hotel and hospitality sector as well as hydropower. Trade chambers are pivotal in building business linkages. The Nepal-Sri Lanka Chamber of Commerce, therefore, is a major partner to develop business engagement. Number of Nepali chambers have entered into MOUs with Sri Lankan counterparts, including the CNI and the FNCCI. Apart from the bilateral agreements, of course, there are regional frameworks provided by SAARC and BIMSTEC, which can also be useful to strengthen economic cooperation. Tourism between Sri Lanka and Nepal has hitherto been largely untapped. Much needs to be done by both countries in this regard. And I think that we need more aggressive marketing to promote tourism in both our countries. It is an absolute necessity. Despite the close proximity and the historical ties, there is a lack of awareness about each other's countries as potential tourist destinations. Therefore, more targeted marketing is needed to raise awareness. Both countries are home to equally breathtaking natural beauty, as well as rich, diverse cultural practices, and each offers a unique and unbeatable experience to the discerning traveler. In Nepal, the biggest attraction for Sri Lankans naturally is Lumbini. However, apart from Mayadevi temple, there is very little information that is available on the other areas of Buddhist significance like Kapilavastu and Ramagrama, which will be equally important for Buddhist pilgrims to visit. Sri Lankans are among the top 5 source countries for tourist arrivals to Nepal, and every year there are about between 50 to 70,000 Sri Lankans that visit Nepal. Outbound tourism from Nepal, Sri Lanka is in the range of 5,500 visitors per year. The COVID pandemic has, of course, brought the tourism industry to a virtual standstill everywhere, and public health will continue to be a concern for many years to come. Therefore, the tourism industry needs fresh thinking and collective action to overcome these challenges and exploit new opportunities. At the same time, the post-COVID world is likely to see more intra-regional interactions, and regional tourism is likely to grow as people will feel more comfortable traveling to destinations closer to home. This could be an opportunity for us, which must be exploited. Buddhist links, once again, provide the ideal springboard for not only Nepal and Sri Lanka, but for the whole region. Tourism is a significant contributor to the GDP in both our countries as well as to our partners in the region. And it is also a great medium for forging closer people-to-people connections. Regionally, there are many opportunities to promote tourism. And there has also been often been talk about a Buddhist circuit in the South Asian region, as many of our countries have had Buddhist influence at some point in their history. So a collective effort will project South Asia as a destination for Buddhist pilgrimage to the world, and this is something we must promote through regional forums. I'm often told that the lack of direct flights is a major impediment to promote tourism, as well as trade and business. This is true to some extent, but there are a number of other reasons, as I mentioned. Of course, having direct flights will definitely give a great boost to tourism and also to trade and business interactions. There has been some positive movement in this regard. Sri Lankan Airlines is considering Kathmandu as a potential new destination for 2020. And I understand that Himalaya Airlines is also interested to recommence flights to Colombo. Both these airlines have operated evacuation flights during the pandemic. So let us hope that they will that will serve as a trial for both the airlines and that they will not be deterred by the COVID pandemic. Then education is also a binding factor between Sri Lanka and Nepal. Buddhist studies and Theravada Buddhism have been the oldest areas of study undertaken by Nepali student monks and nuns in Sri Lanka for many, many years. Many Nepali students I know go abroad for their higher education, and Sri Lanka offers an attractive and competitive option closer to home for them to explore. There are close to about 50 Nepali students following higher studies in Sri Lanka at present, and there are about a little over 100 Sri Lankan students in Nepal. The majority of them are studying medicine. Sri Lanka also offers 5 presidential scholarships every year to Nepal in various fields of education. And there are some private universities and colleges as well that offer placements to Nepali students. We have also signed an agreement exempting students of our 2 countries from paying student visa fees in the other country to encourage more students to study in each other's countries. Youth development and sports is another area that can be pursued. Cricket, I understand, is gaining in popularity in Nepal, while in Sri Lanka it is a passion. So cricket can be a link to build sports and youth, bring the youth from the 2 countries together. Sri Lanka and Nepal have also signed an MOU in 2018 on cooperation in youth development. And this agreement is expected to give more impetus for closer exchanges between the young people in our 2 countries. And I must say that Sri Lanka has taken part in sporting and youth events in Nepal. A Sri Lankan netball, school netball team participated in a South Asian netball tournament in Kathmandu last October. Then a contingent of over 500 Sri Lankan athletes took part in the 13th South Asian Games, also in Kathmandu last December. Similarly, a delegation of Nepali youth participated in a youth camp in Sri Lanka in 2017, along with many other youths from several countries. Defense and security cooperation also play a crucial role in the bilateral relationship. Nepal and Sri Lanka both contribute military personnel to UN peacekeeping missions, and bilaterally we exchange training opportunities for military officers in various defense courses, both short-term and long-term, every year. There is room for enhanced cooperation in security, given the new aspects of issues confronting all states, such as transnational crimes, violent extremism, and cybercrime. As small developing countries with many development challenges, Sri Lanka and Nepal are often confronted with extreme climatic conditions and natural disasters. As we saw in Nepal in 2015 with the earthquake, and as we are seeing in floods and landslides in both countries, and also the 2004 tsunami that devastated much of Asian countries, including Sri Lanka. It is noteworthy that despite our own domestic limitations, Sri Lanka and Nepal have shown solidarity and helped each other during such times. After the 2015 earthquake, Sri Lanka was one of the first countries to send a special aircraft with doctors, engineers, and other military personnel to provide emergency rescue and relief assistance. The Sri Lankan government also undertook the reconstruction of 2 temples in the Kathmandu Valley that were severely damaged. The Anandakuti Vihar in Swayambhu was completely reconstructed and handed over. Then renovation work at the heritage temple of Prathoma Chindranath in Bungamati is still underway. Nepal has also extended its solidarity to Sri Lanka during natural disasters and has provided financial assistance to flood and landslide victims in 2016 as well as 2017. So when it comes to multilateral fora also, Sri Lanka and Nepal have enjoyed close cooperation. Due to the similarities in our foreign policy outlooks, we often have converging views when it comes to engagement at regional and international organizations. As founding members of the non-aligned movement, both countries have shown commitment to peaceful coexistence with other countries. In 1971, when Sri Lanka brought an initiative to declare the Indian Ocean a zone of peace at the UNGA, it was supported by Nepal. Similarly, King Birendra's proposal to declare Nepal as a zone of peace was supported by Sri Lanka. Nepal and Sri Lanka closely consult with other partners within the Colombo process, which is under the IOM, and where common issues facing migrant workers are discussed from the perspective of labor sending as well as labor receiving countries. This is particularly important, I believe, in the context of the COVID pandemic. The pandemic has exposed the vulnerabilities faced by our migrant workers. And as you know, the remittances sent by migrant workers is a very important contribution to the economies in both countries. So therefore, we must collectively work within this process, the Colombo process, to address issues that are the new issues that have arisen for our migrant workers. Our cooperation within the UN and specialized agencies is also very strong, including in extending support to each other's candidatures in various UN bodies. Nepal and Sri Lanka have consistently shown commitment to move forward within SAARC and BIMSTEC. Our commitment to regional cooperation was reiterated by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa following his election last year. We should also pursue new avenues for cooperation while pooling resources to address some common and global challenges such as climate change, food security, and health security, both regionally as well as internationally, because these are issues that, that affect all countries. In this context, Nepal's initiative to establish a global climate conservation platform through the Sagarmatha Samvad is commendable. Given such strong historical and cultural connections, what are the prospects for more tangible cooperation between Nepal and Sri Lanka? At government level, the bilateral relations, as I mentioned, have withstood the test of time and continue to grow. We need to explore ways to translate this into a more productive and mutually beneficial partnership. And it is obvious that the economic relations will hold the key. Both Sri Lanka and Nepal are seeking better economic prospects for their peoples, like any developing country. In Nepal, the system of governance has transformed from a monarchy to a federal democratic republic, and Nepal is better connected to the world with more and more Nepali people traveling out, as well as establishing links across the world. Nepal has recorded robust economic growth over the last 3 years. Higher remittances and surging tourist arrivals have given a boost to growth in multiple sectors, while private consumption has increased. There are, of course, challenges for both our countries. And I have already mentioned about developments in Sri Lanka, so I will not go over that again. But next month, I must mention that we will have parliamentary elections in Sri Lanka. So there will be a new government, and we should use this opportunity to build on our strong relationship. There is potential, I believe, for our bilateral relationship to progress along multiple tracks. I have already mentioned about tourism and education. Technical cooperation, trade and investment are some of the other important sectors. The potential for tourism cooperation, as I mentioned, is largely untapped, and there are many opportunities that we must seize. So focus on heavily. And while it is unfortunate that the Visit Nepal 2020 campaign had to be suspended due to COVID, I hope that the initiatives undertaken under that will not be completely abandoned. In the immediate aftermath of the COVID pandemic, we can expect increased protectionism and travel and trade restrictions, which can hamper our access to traditional markets and sources of foreign exchange. In such a context, we will need to diversify our import supply sources as well as our export markets. Trading with regional partners is likely to gain more importance and will assume greater relevance. Therefore, we must make the challenges posed by COVID an opportunity and work towards reaping the best outcomes from that for both our countries. Sri Lanka and Nepal annually import a total goods worth approximately 19 billion US dollars and 11 billion US dollars respectively from various supply sources. Sri Lanka's total exports are worth 11 billion US dollars, while Nepal's total exports are somewhere around 840 million US dollars. Despite this, bilateral trade remains marginal between Sri Lanka and Nepal, but it has shown significant improvement over the last few years. Particularly over the last 2 years, from 1.78 million US dollars in 2017, bilateral trade has increased to 6.87 million US dollars in 2019. So this is quite a significant increase, although the numbers are still low. I believe that there is tremendous potential to enhance the trade partnership. The trade chambers between the two countries, as well as the private sectors and the regional chambers, have a significant and active role to play in growing trade opportunities. Technical cooperation is another avenue that we can pursue. Gem and jewelry, tea, and archaeological conservation have already figured in bilateral discussions in the past as possible areas for technical cooperation, and these should be actively pursued. Intra-regional investments will play a key role towards economic prosperity of our peoples. Several Sri Lankan companies have expanded out of Sri Lanka and invested in SAARC and BIMSTEC countries, as well as in Africa, in sectors such as apparels, finances, hospitality, healthcare, tourism, and IT BPM sectors. They should also look at Nepal as a potential investment destination. Barring a few sectors with restrictions, Sri Lanka welcomes investment and has established an open and friendly governance regime to facilitate FDI into the country and removed restrictions on repatriation of profits. Sri Lanka is fast becoming a maritime hub with advanced transport and transshipment facilities. It is home to 3 major ports: Colombo, Trincomalee, and Hambantota. The Colombo port is ranked 13th in global rankings for connectivity and is the best in South Asia. The Colombo port city is a long-term investment that aims to position Sri Lanka as a financial hub for companies that are looking to establish operations in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka therefore provides an ideal option for export-oriented manufacturing for Nepali companies. As Asia becomes a major part of global economic activity, the Indian Ocean will see increased maritime traffic related to trade in the time to come. Sri Lanka's strategic location therefore gives it an undeniable advantage that can be leveraged by Nepali businesses. Nepal and Sri Lanka are both looking to advance economic development for their future prosperity, and hence we should also focus on investments in taking forward our bilateral relations. Therefore, it is up to us to realize this potential in a manner that is mutually beneficial for our peoples. Given the historic relations and the development outlook, I'm confident that relations between our two countries will always remain friendly and forward-looking. The governments, as well as the private sectors of both countries, should look at closer cooperation creating awareness, as well as building commercial confidence to take the relationship to the next level. Thank you. I will stop there. I hope I haven't overstepped the time. Dr. Jaishwal?
Thank you, ma'am. No, you are on time. Thank you, Excellency, for your wonderful and comprehensive presentation. It was really enlightening. We learned a lot about the relationship between two countries. We have received a huge number of questions from the audience. So without wasting time, I would immediately share you the questions. The first question is, Nepal and Sri Lanka both have Hindus and Buddhist links. So both countries can develop Hindu circuit and Buddhist circuit that you have discussed about. So are there any steps taken by the government of both countries to develop that?
Yes, definitely. As I mentioned also in my presentation, Buddhist links is one of the, I would say, one of the central links between the two countries. And Lumbini is the site in Nepal which attracts the largest number of Sri Lankan tourists. At the same time, there are other Buddhist sites in Nepal. As I again mentioned, these should be, there should be more marketing, I think, particularly with regard to places like Kapilavastu and Ramagrama, because there isn't that much information available. But I'm sure that the Buddhist pilgrims to Lumbini will be very interested to visit these places as well. Then in Sri Lanka also there are Buddhist tourist sites. I mentioned the Sri Dalada Maligawa, which houses the sacred tooth relic of Lord Buddha. And we have many other sacred sites in Sri Lanka where sacred relics are enshrined. And I know that in Nepal, both Hinduism and Buddhism, they go side by side. So there will be a lot of cultural interest for Nepali tourists to visit Sri Lanka. When it comes to Hinduism, Nepal, of course, I mean, the majority of the people are Hindu, and you have Pashupatinath. Then there are other places of interest like Muktinath and many others. I'm sure that in Sri Lanka also we have about 12% Hindus. So they will find very interesting to visit. On the other hand, in Sri Lanka, we have Hindu sites, tourist sites, which I'm sure that Nepali travelers will also find interesting. Also, as I mentioned, regionally, there has been some talk about developing a Buddhist circuit, but unfortunately, that hasn't developed into reality yet. But definitely, I think we should encourage, because it's not only Nepal and Sri Lanka, there are many other countries in the region which have very important Buddhist as well as Hindu places, sites. So these can be collectively promoted to promote South Asian region as a tourist, pilgrimage location for world tourists. So I think definitely we should work together on that.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is, there is an interesting photo on the poster of today's event where there is colorful mountain whose color resembles with Sri Lankan flag. Does it have any meaning if you have seen that poster?
Yes, I think that is the Sigiriya rock. Sigiriya means lion rock, Simhagiri. It's an ancient fortress, and before it became a fortress, actually it had been a monastery. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and because of the ancient engineering and archaeological architectural technology that had been used there, and it's one of the major, I would say, the most visited tourist site in Sri Lanka, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
There's another interesting question, like how both the countries, Sri Lanka and Nepal, work in reviving the SAARC, like what role they can play in strengthening the capacity of SAARC.
Yes, as I mentioned, after his election last year, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa reiterated Sri Lanka's commitment to regional cooperation, and he mentioned SAARC by name. Nepal also being the home to the SAARC Secretariat. Both our countries have interest in promoting, in taking SAARC forward. I think we all know that there are certain bilateral tensions that have prevented SAARC from moving forward. But I also believe that Nepal and Sri Lanka can encourage SAARC activities. In fact, I think there are a lot of things that are happening outside the political sphere, on the cultural side, on business interactions, many things that are ongoing, which may not be as visible because the summit hasn't taken place, but these activities are continuing. So unfortunately, I think according to the SAARC Charter, all decisions have to be made by consensus. So this is one of the largest obstacles to SAARC moving forward. But even during the COVID pandemic, there was an initiative to bring all the leaders together and talk about a COVID fund, a common fund where member countries can draw from for their COVID response. So there are initiatives that are happening, and I think as two countries which have which share good relations with all our other member countries, Sri Lanka and Nepal can collectively maybe encourage SAARC to move forward. But unfortunately, I mean, SAARC is as good as its member states. So it is not something that one or two member countries can do. All the members have to come forward.
There is one very interesting question by one of our participants. He says that Nepal and Sri Lanka have emotional relations due to Buddhist link. During Rama regime in Nepal, Buddhists were prosecuted by the government, but Bhikkhushu Narad came to Nepal and helped disseminate Theravada Buddhism there. Since then, there were numerous exchanges of Buddhist monks and pilgrims between the two countries. So could you please elaborate more on the Buddhist aspect of our relations?
The Buddhist aspects of our relations?
Yes.
Okay. I think I also covered some of it in the presentation. As I mentioned, Buddhism is I would say the very first links between our two countries. The Mahavansha, which is the great chronicle on Sri Lankan history, talks about the marriage between a Shakya princess and the second king of Sri Lanka. These linkages, I think, have come about because of the Buddhist links that were there in the ancient times, which have continued throughout. And in the 1940s, 1946, there was a delegation of Sri Lankan Buddhist monks that came, led by Venerable Narada Mahathero, who interceded with the Nepal Prime Minister at the time to revive Theravada Buddhism in Nepal. That was, I believe that was a difficult time in Nepal, and Theravada Buddhism was kind of dying down. So this delegation interceded with the government at the time to revive Theravada Buddhism, which has, and that was successful. And that priest also requested that Vaishak Purnima be declared a public holiday. I mean, it is important because Lumbini is in Nepal, so he felt that Vaishak Purnima should be a public holiday in Nepal, and I believe it is now. So like this, and from that time, even before that, actually, there have been Buddhist monks from Nepal who have gone to Sri Lanka for studies, particularly in Theravada Buddhism. And even today, there are many priests, and it has been, actually, I have been pleasantly surprised to find many Nepali priests who speak fluent Sinhala, because they have studied in Sri Lanka, they have lived in Sri Lanka, and they still retain a very warm connection, very fond memories of their time in Sri Lanka. And personally, I think that they are a great ambassador for, they are great ambassadors for Sri Lanka in Nepal. So the Buddhist links between our two countries are very, very strong.
Let's move to the next question. What steps government of Sri Lanka has taken in recent times to fight terrorism aftermath of the Easter terror attack?
Yes, well, let me go back before the Easter Sunday attacks. As I mentioned, Sri Lanka was a victim of separatist terrorism for about 30 years. In 2009, the terrorists, the LTTE, were militarily defeated decisively. Up to that time, when we talked about terrorism, our focus was on the LTTE. And it was a very long-term situation for us. I mean, 30 years is not a short time. And I must say that the majority of our resources went for this. Not only fighting terrorism, but also the propaganda war that they were carrying out. And the Sri Lankan missions overseas also had a very primary role to play in particularly in fighting propaganda, and also because the LTT was raising funds outside Sri Lanka to fight the war in Sri Lanka. So until 2009, therefore, our primary focus was on the LTT terrorism. And this has not abated, I must say. Although they have been militarily defeated, there have been evidence, there have been incidents that happened in Sri Lanka to show that there are elements who are still trying to revive the organization. Of course, I don't know whether they will be able to come back with the same force or the same military strength, but I mean, it doesn't take much for a terrorist group to come together and create violence and damage. And also, it must be mentioned that some of the LTT elements that are abroad, they are still there. And now they are carrying out a propaganda war against Sri Lanka. The 2019 Easter Sunday attacks, that was carried out by a small group of Sri Lankan group of extremists. Of course, they were inspired by ISIS. And what was very deadly about that attack was that on one day at around, I would say within 2 hours time or something like that, they coordinated and carried out attacks in about 7 places in Sri Lanka. And they were mainly Catholic churches and tourist hotels, prominent tourist hotels. So this was very deadly because the target was, I mean, clearly at the one of the religious communities in Sri Lanka, the Catholics, and it was on Easter Sunday. Also the tourist hotels. It's a very direct attack against tourism, and the tourism industry suffered a lot after that. So, but of course, at the beginning, there was suspicion whether it was how they managed to carry out such a coordinated attack, because obviously it's hard to believe that a local grown group could have carried out that kind of coordinated attack without sources of funds and assistance from outside. And after that, our security forces were able to find a video where these 7 suicide bombers, they had recorded a video. They are paying their allegiance to the ISIS. So it was very clear that that attack was inspired by IS extremist ideology. And that attack was like an eye-opener for the Sri Lankan public, that we are not immune from terrorism even after the 2009, after the conflict came to an end. So that opened up our views, our ideas about the public, I'm saying, the security forces and the intelligence agencies, of course, they had, they knew about these extremist groups operating, but to the public, this was the first sign that apart from the LTT, there were relaxed in their security outlook. They were not as careful. Particularly when you look at the hotels, even the normal security measures had been relaxed. So that was a great mistake, but we have learned a lesson, and I hope that we will be able to stop something like that in the future.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is how Sri Lanka and Nepal can work together for having peaceful and cooperative South Asia so that we could concentrate on economic development and upgrading our people's standard of life.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
How both people from both the countries can work together for having peaceful and cooperative South Asia so that we could concentrate on economic development and upgrading our people's standard of life.
Okay, I think I mentioned about South Asia and regional cooperation. Not only SAARC, we also have BIMSTEC, but that is, I don't know, unfortunately within the South Asian region, the two regional organizations we have seem not to have had their full potential. So it's up to the countries in the region, obviously, to decide to what extent they want these organizations to work. But I don't think we should wait for the organizations to do something. Maybe the countries bilaterally can work together, because particularly now after COVID, there are many areas, vulnerable areas that pose common issues to us. One is migration, migrant labor. In both Nepal and Sri Lanka, there are so many migrant workers who are returning to the country. Some of them have lost their jobs, and we don't know whether they will be able to go back. And that will lead to employment in both the countries. So there are many economic issues that we are going to have to face in the post-COVID scenario. So as I mentioned, there is opportunity for us to work together within processes like the Colombo process, which is specifically there for to discuss about migrant worker issues, not only from the perspective of labor sending countries, but also labor receiving countries, which is very important. Also, I think that after COVID, the focus is going to be more on intra-regional cooperation, because we have seen that the entire world was brought to a kind of a standstill with COVID. So this has shown us the downside of globalization. And I believe that this is that we should use that as an opportunity to make the regional cooperation more vibrant. And when I say regional cooperation, it's not only, it's more importantly economic cooperation, but also political, for people-to-people interaction and everything else. But most importantly for economic cooperation, because the traditional sources of our raw material, our import markets, as well as our export markets may have time to, because countries are going to be more careful about their own security and their own, when I say security, like food security, within their own country, and also the security of having the necessary medicines. So these are things that countries within South Asia must cooperate on, and to make sure that our people will not lack, will not suffer due to food security or lack of medicine, things like that. I mean, there are countries that produce drugs in medicinal drugs within the South Asian region. We should make use of that, and economically, I think we should cooperate more to build intra-regional collaboration. And as I said, I think we should really use this as an opportunity to strengthen that.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is on geopolitics. Like, Nepal often complain of Indian high-handedness and being trapped between India and China rivalry. What is the Sri Lankan experience? How Sri Lanka balance its relation with India and China?
I must say that Sri Lanka's relations with both these countries have been are very good. India is our closest neighbor, and historically we have had very good relations with India, and we still do. It's a very multifaceted relationship, and at present it's one of our main trade markets, as well as one of our main investors, and also for our security. India is a very crucial partner for us. So it is, I mean, we can't choose we can't change our geography. So we have to work with our neighbors. We can't change them. So we have to work with them. And I must say that with India, we have, of course, there have been ups and downs, as is normal in any relationship, I believe. There have been ups and downs in our relationship with India, but right now we have very good cooperation and very good relations. When it comes to China, I must say that China has been a solid friend of Sri Lanka from the time we regained independence. It had been an important trading partner, starting from the Rubber Rice Pact in 1950. And they have continued to be a very important trading partner for us. India is the #1 tourism source country to Sri Lanka, and China is the second. And also China is a very important investment partner, as well as one of our major trade partners for exports. So, and not to mention, it's like both these countries are very fast developing and emerging powers. I mean, it's not only India and China, but with any country, I believe that we have to work at the challenges that we face, and make use of the positive sides and develop on that. Because, and particularly these two countries, I would say that economically and politically, they are very important partners for Sri Lanka.
Ma'am, there's another question very similar to that, like MCC. US-sponsored MCC grant is another mutual element between Nepal and Sri Lanka. What does Sri Lanka has to offer to learn from the MCC experience? Like, what Nepal and Sri Lanka can learn from the MCC experience? There's another similar question on MCC. Nepal and Sri Lanka both failed to sign MCC, which is Millennium Challenge Cooperation. What is your comment on this?
Yes, MCC in Sri Lanka, it has been discussed for a number of years. And I must say that we have not signed the MCC yet. From what I know, there are two projects right now. The projects that are being discussed right now, one is on land and one is on road development. But these are not the projects that had been there before, so there had been an evolution in the discussions. it's a process, you know. I believe, I mean, I don't want to go into the Nepal MCC, but talking from the Sri Lankan perspective, of course, whenever there are this kind of big economic projects, there's a debate in the public, and similarly there is a debate over the MCC in Sri Lanka. This has led the government, the present government, to appoint a committee to study the MCC, the draft agreement. And this report is now with the Cabinet of Ministers for them to study and give their views. But from what I see, the problematic, the project that has created the most debate is the land project, because I believe it talks about land being kind of made available for private parties to purchase land, and there are certain sensitivities with regard to that. And of course, there are other clauses in the draft which are believed to impinge on Sri Lanka's sovereignty. So these are some of the issues that have been cited as being problematic to agree to the MCC as drafted, as it is now. So there are, I mean, various views in the public, but let's see what the committee, the Cabinet of Ministers come up with. They are now studying the report that has been submitted by this committee, and basically what it has said is that it shouldn't be signed in its present form. That so it remains to be seen what the Cabinet of Ministers is going to decide.
The next question is on Belt and Road. Like, what is the status of BRI projects in Sri Lanka? How do you look at the opportunities of BRI, especially in the context that there are lots of news coming that Sri Lanka has gone into the death trap?
Yes, there are BRI. I mean, one of the most important aspects of BRI is connectivity, and there are several projects, for example, the Colombo Port City, which I mentioned, which is also called the Financial City Project. It is a long-term investment which seeks to facilitate operations for foreign companies that invest in Sri Lanka, providing finances and logistics and other services. So this is, as I said, it's a long-term project, and it's on reclaimed land next to the Colombo port. One other thing is close to the Hambantota port, there is an industrial zone that comes under this project. It's a very important economic development project, and as a developing country, I mean, Sri Lanka doesn't, as I mentioned, we were under 30 years of conflict for 30 years. So our economic development was has slowed down to a large extent. So we need foreign investment to get our economy going, you know, as a result, these projects are important for us to get economic activity going. And I mentioned that the government is repositioning Sri Lanka as a hub in the South Asian region, not only as a maritime hub, but it is also trying to reposition it as a logistics hub. Which is expected to provide all the necessary facilities for shipping lines and all trading. I mean, as I mentioned, Asia is going to see a lot of activity it already is, but in time to come also, because the economic shift is towards Asia. So we want to benefit from our strategic location, and position ourselves to get economic benefits from this increased maritime traffic. So in that context, the BRI projects are important for us because it helps us, gives us the finances which we don't have to build our capacities to be able to do that. The idea about the debt trap, it's actually, it's how to say, it's an exaggerated view in my view, because when you look at the Chinese debt that Sri Lanka owes, it's only about 9% of our total debts to foreign parties. You know, like we have bilateral lenders, we have international lenders, but our loan debt percentage to China is about 9%. Whereas as bilateral partners, the debt that we owe to China is equal to the same as what we owe to India. It's about, I think, 14%. And much of that is also concessional loans. At the commercial rate, I believe, I don't have the figures now, but I think it is not as high as what it is projected to be. So it's I mean, Sri Lanka is a developing country, and we borrowing from the international parties, from the international market is not something new. That is something that all developing countries do. And I must say that we have never defaulted on our debt servicing also. So that is something that must be kept in mind. We have not defaulted. And this is this whole debt trap kind of perception is a bit exaggerated in my view, because as I said, it's only about 9% of our total debt.
Let's go to next question. The next question is, Sri Lanka is considered to be one of the most progressive among all the South Asian countries in terms of the situation of women. Despite the fact most Sri Lankan women occupy position of limited influence in social, political, and economic sector of society. What initiative does the country plan to adopt to elevate this evident gap and changing the status of women in Sri Lanka?
Okay, yes, we have very high human development indices for South Asia, particularly on education and health. And with regard to women's participation in economic and political activity, I think it is only in politics, particularly in parliament, that the numbers are low. I mean, low when you compare, particularly in the region, like Nepal, for example, the numbers are low. But I must say that in all other activities of society, for example, in administration, banking, private sector, government sector, women's participation is on par, if not more, than men. If you look at the foreign service, which is my own background, in the foreign service, the last few years, there have been more female officers that have been recruited than males. I mean, they compete on equal terms with their male counterparts. So there is no, it's not a case of there being any discrimination or anything as such. I believe the reason for low numbers in political participation is due to the low number of women who come forward to take part in politics, because it's a challenging task, particularly in South Asia. But interestingly, in South Asia has also seen a number of female politicians. And I must say that Sri Lanka produced the first prime minister in the world, Mrs. Srimawa Bandaranayake. Then we also had a female president, Mrs. Chandrika Bandaranayake Kumaratunga. And we have had many female ministers. We have had chief justices, female. We have many lawyers, and in the private sector, as I mentioned, even holding very high positions. The current head of our tourism promotion authority is a female, and the former head of our export development board was a female. So, I mean, like that, there are many women in holding many high positions. So there is no particular reason for it, I will say.
The next question is something related to Nepal, and maybe if you don't feel like answering, you can skip it, because it's something related to internal politics. Like in Nepal, sometimes Madhesi leaders state that Nepal should learn from ethnic tension of Sri Lanka, and state that if Nepal fails to deliver the demand of ethnic groups, such as representation and language rights, Nepal can fall into civil war. So what's your take on this?
Well, as you mentioned, Dr. Jaiswal, I don't want to comment on something that is internal to Nepal.
Sure,
but also, I mean, because Sri Lanka has been cited, I must say that you can't compare two countries. You can't compare the situation in two countries because the ground context is different. So these are naturally in multicultural societies, there are issues that come up. There are challenges, and in Sri Lanka we had challenges, but in our case it became a problem because it developed into a terrorist. It went up to a level of, I mean, violence that we couldn't ignore. And there have been successive governments in Sri Lanka who tried to negotiate with the LTTE, but unfortunately, after several rounds of negotiations, it became apparent that they were not interested in talks. So that is why the government had to go for a military option. And there were other countries that were involved in some of these negotiations. But unfortunately, the LTT was not keen. I mean, their only objective was to get a separate state. And that was not something that the Sri Lankan government, any Sri Lankan government would compromise on. So you can't compare situations, but that is basically what happened in Sri Lanka. But of course, as I mentioned, when there are dividing, you have to take on board all their concerns and try and resolve them. And there have been concerns from the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka, and many of these issues were discussed, and they have been addressed, and they have been rectified. But I mean, unfortunately, sometimes when for what happened in my country, they were not willing to come down from that demand of a separate state. So when you come with that kind of position, you can't negotiate. So I believe it's important to prevent in societies. It's important to prevent from coming to that kind of untenable situation. And it's always good to try and negotiate and resolve problems if you can, but of course you need two hands.
Both Sri Lanka and Nepal get huge number of tourists. Sorry.
Hello. Yes.
Yes. Sorry, there was some problem with it. And both Sri Lanka and Nepal get huge number of tourists. Still, both the countries are not connected with each other. Can you hear me?
Sorry, the voice dropped. Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Both Sri Lanka and Nepal get huge number of tourists. Still, both the countries are not connected with each other, which you have addressed partially. How can both the countries connect and add tourists visiting to them? That is first part of the question, which you have addressed. Second is, why there is no investment plans in Nepal to do business for Sri Lankans or maybe for Nepalese in Sri Lanka?
Why there is no, sorry,
investment or business between the two countries? Why there is no more economic engagement between the two countries?
Yeah, well, with regard to connectivity, I think I addressed that in the presentation, and I fully appreciate that it is something we need to address if we are going to see more tourists. And also, as I mentioned, I hope that we can rectify that soon, because there has been interest shown by both Sri Lankan Airlines and Himalaya Airlines. With regard to investment, of course, I mean, both our countries have gone through political transformations in recent times. So I think there is a lack of awareness and appreciation of each other's markets. But I must mention that we do have some investment from and joint ventures with Nepal, as I mentioned in the past, and also currently there are collaborations on hydropower as well as hospitality. But in future, definitely there is more opportunity. And from the embassy side, we are looking at that very actively. And I'm sure that the Nepal embassy. But the main reason I believe is this, because we are kind of still finding the way each other, you know, because of the political transformations and the changes that have taken place. In Nepal's case, after the new constitution, I think in 2015, this is the first government that was elected after the new constitution was promulgated. So there are new policies now, and it's a federal system of government also. So there are many changes, and it takes a little time, I believe, for the private sector and the economic partners also to kind of understand, particularly the ones in Sri Lanka, to understand the ground situation here. And we are looking to rectify that, and I hope that before soon that we will see positive results. But already, as I mentioned, there's a Sri Lankan company that has invested in a joint venture in hydropower, and I understand there are more opportunities in that. That is something that Sri Lanka has a lot of experience in, hydropower. There are companies which have invested in Africa as well, and definitely we will look to attract more investment in that regard. But there are other sectors as well, like hospitality, construction and infrastructure, like road development, for example, healthcare and education. So there are many opportunities, and I think we really should make use of this post-COVID context to build more intra-regional cooperation, and this is a good opportunity for Nepal, Sri Lanka as well.
We have come towards the end of program, so let me ask the last question. We still have around 30 questions, but we have no time. So the last question for today will be, you mentioned about maritime security and intra-regional tourism. How has Sri Lanka committed to IORA, Indian Ocean Regional Rim Organization, and the Indian Ocean Regional Building? This is the last question.
Yes, Sri Lanka is a very important partner in IORA, and it's something that we seriously believe in. As I mentioned, for us being an island country, maritime security and maritime economic activity is crucial for us, including maritime trade. And we hope to see more action, more movement within the IORA also. And recently we have initiated at international level dialogue on Indian Ocean maritime security and maritime, particularly on maritime security. And we had, I think in 2018, we had a conference in Sri Lanka, and there was another ministerial conference that was initiated after that on maritime security.
as I mentioned, I mean, we have been from very long ago, we have been involved even at international level in discussions and negotiations about maritime affairs. I give the example of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. We want to see the freedom of navigation in the open seas. It's very important to us as an island country. And I mean, the majority of international trade takes place through maritime routes. So it's important that countries have that facility to conduct trade, and it must be facilitated by literal countries that have, that are, I believe they are called littoral states, which have coastal areas. And even for landlocked countries such as Nepal, I believe that the relevant UN conventions and platforms, the agreements should be made available to them to access ports. Because I mean, it's a geographical challenge, but there are UN conventions that allow landlocked countries access to ports, and that is something very important. And I believe that Sri Lanka being an island, maybe there are opportunities for Nepal to look at Sri Lanka and use our ports for your external trade activities with other countries.
Excellency, thank you very much for your valuable time. We are really grateful for your time and wonderful presentation. We wish to have such opportunities in future as well. We'd also like to thank our participants for the wonderful questions. Thank you very much and have a nice day.